My son, please, she pushed me. I didn't touch her. I swear.
What would you do if the person you trusted most looked you in the eye and told you a terrible accident had just happened? But the victim whispered something else. What if the truth wasn't hidden in a security camera, a confession, or a courtroom, but in the quiet memory of a child too young to understand why adults lie? And how long do you think you could live under the same roof with someone if, deep down, you started to wonder whether the scream that changed everything was never meant to be an accident at all? The first scream came before anyone in the Whitmore estate even understood that something had gone wrong. It split through the house like a blade through glass, sharp, sudden, unnatural. And then, almost worse than the scream itself, came the silence that followed it. A silence so complete it felt alive. The kind of silence that makes every person inside it freeze for one terrible second before the panic sets in. Nathaniel Whitmore was on the third floor of his home, standing in his private office with one hand on the edge of his desk and the other holding his phone. He had been finishing a late call with his board of directors, half listening to a discussion about numbers, acquisitions, and an overseas expansion he had spent months preparing. It was the kind of call that usually held his full attention. Nathaniel was not a man known for distraction. He was methodical, disciplined, and almost unnervingly composed under pressure. But the instant he heard that scream, all of that vanished. He didn't excuse himself from the call. He didn't even think. The phone slipped from his hand, hit the rug, and the voices on the other end kept talking into empty air as he ran. By the time he reached the top of the grand staircase, his body stopped even before his mind could catch up with what he was seeing. At the bottom of the stairs lay Margaret Whitmore, his mother. 64 years old, brilliant, proud, sharp-tongued, unimpressed by nearly everyone. The kind of woman who could silence an entire room with a look and correct a billionaire without raising her voice. She was not just his mother. She was the first force that had ever shaped him, the person whose standards had built him, challenged him, and made him impossible to deceive for most of his life. And now she was crumpled on the marble floor. One hand was braced awkwardly against the ground, as if she had tried, too late, to stop herself. Her cane lay several steps above her, at an angle that made no immediate sense. It wasn't beside her. It wasn't beneath her. It looked as if it had been knocked away before she ever reached the bottom. And at the top of the staircase, only a few feet from where Margaret must have fallen, stood Vivian Cole. Vivian, his fiancée. Vivian, 29 years old, stunning, graceful, impeccably controlled. The woman he had planned to marry in just a few weeks. She had one hand pressed dramatically over her mouth. Her eyes were wide. Her breathing looked shallow and uneven, and when Nathaniel turned toward her for the briefest moment, she looked exactly like someone who had just witnessed a horrible accident. "She fell," Vivian whispered. Her voice trembled in just the right places. "Nathaniel, I was right behind her. She lost her footing. I tried, I couldn't." But he was already moving. He took the stairs too fast, nearly slipping himself, and dropped to his knees beside his mother. Her face had gone pale beneath the chandelier light, but she was conscious. That was the first mercy. Pain was written across her features in unmistakable lines, and when her eyes found his, there was confusion in them. But not the confusion of someone who didn't know what had happened. It was the confusion of someone who knew exactly what had happened and couldn't believe it. "I didn't fall," Margaret said. Just that. 3 quiet words, clear enough that he heard them, certain enough that he would remember them long after everything else blurred. Then her eyes closed and her body sagged with pain. Paramedics arrived quickly, though not quickly enough for Nathaniel's nerves. The ride to the hospital felt endless. The diagnosis came later: a fractured wrist, 2 badly bruised ribs, and a hairline fracture at the base of her left hip. Painful, serious, but not fatal. The doctor said she was fortunate. With time, treatment, and rest, she would recover fully. Margaret Whitmore did not believe in luck. And sometime during that endless night, sitting in the hard chair beside her hospital bed and listening to the steady machinery of recovery, Nathaniel realized that he didn't believe in luck anymore either. Back at the estate, after the ambulance had gone and the immediate panic had settled into hush and whispers, Vivian sat in the main sitting room with a glass of water in front of her that she never once touched. The household staff had pulled back into the invisible corners of the house where people like them were expected to disappear during family crises. The estate had become unnaturally quiet, as though the walls themselves were listening. Except for one sound. From the half-open laundry room off the back hallway came the soft, steady hum of a child. Rosa Delgado, the Whitmores' live-in housekeeper, had been working in the estate for 3 years. She was 26, hard-working, careful, discreet, and so efficient she had become part of the house's rhythm. She moved through rooms without disturbing them. She spoke only when necessary. She kept other people's lives in order and asked for very little in return. But her daughter Lily was not like Rosa at all. Lily was 3 years old, round-cheeked, bright-eyed, loud when she wanted to be, endlessly curious, and utterly incapable of pretending not to notice what she had noticed. She did not yet understand adult politics, adult fear, or adult convenience. She saw things plainly, said them plainly. And that night, unknown to almost everyone in the house, Lily had been sitting on the upstairs hallway floor with her wooden blocks when Margaret Whitmore fell. She had seen everything. If you love stories where one tiny detail changes everything, take a second to like the channel and subscribe right now, because this one only gets deeper from here. And trust me, the truth in this house was just getting started. Nathaniel did not sleep. Not that night. Not even close. He remained in the hospital room long after visiting hours should have ended, staring at his mother's face as if looking long enough might reveal something he had missed. He replayed the scene again and again. The scream, the cane, Vivian's hand over her mouth, the tears that had come quickly and then seemed, in memory, to vanish too quickly as well. He had loved Vivian. At least, he had believed he did. Nathaniel was 38 and not easy to reach. He had spent most of his adult life becoming a man people respected, feared, or wanted something from. Very few had ever managed to become important to him in a personal way. Vivian had. She had been patient with his reserve, warm where he was distant, socially effortless where he was precise. She seemed to understand how to stand beside power without competing with it. Over time, almost without realizing when it happened, he had started imagining a future that included her in permanent ways. But his mother had said, "I didn't fall." Margaret was not prone to dramatics. She was not confused easily. And she was not the sort of woman who tossed words into a room carelessly, especially not words like those. Morning came gray and thin through the hospital window. Nathaniel kissed his mother's forehead, told the nurses he'd return later, and drove back to the estate with the kind of exhaustion that sharpens suspicion instead of dulling it. Vivian was already awake. Of course she was. She sat at the kitchen island in a cream-colored blouse, hair perfect, posture perfect, a mug of coffee between her hands. She looked up the moment he entered, and concern appeared on her face with such immediate precision that it would have seemed loving to anyone who wasn't already doubting her. "How is she?" Vivian asked softly. "Is she going to be okay? I've been worried sick all night." "She's stable," Nathaniel said. He sat across from her, studying her expression in a way he never had before. Then he said, "She told me she didn't fall." For the smallest fraction of a second, something changed behind Vivian's eyes. Not panic, not guilt. Something more controlled than that. A recalculation. "She hit her head, Nathaniel," Vivian said gently. "And she's older. She may not remember clearly. I was right there. I saw it happen. Her cane slipped near the edge of the step. She went forward before I could catch her." It was a perfect answer. Reasonable. Calm. Detailed enough to feel real. Emotional enough to sound sincere. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I'm sure you're right," he said. But he wasn't sure. And Vivian, who had always been excellent at reading shifts in mood, knew exactly how uncertain he sounded. By afternoon, the story had begun to settle around the house, and not by accident. Vivian started offering it quietly to anyone who asked. Margaret had always been a little unsteady on the stairs. Margaret had refused to allow a stair lift to be installed. Margaret didn't want rail grips because she considered them a symbol of weakness. Tragic, yes, but mysterious? No. These things happened. A woman of a certain age takes one bad step, and suddenly a household is turned upside down. The staff listened, nodded, and said very little. That was what staff did. Rosa also said nothing. She changed sheets, prepared meals, managed the laundry, and kept Lily close beside her whenever she could. But that evening, while folding fresh towels in the laundry room, she felt a small tug on her sleeve. "Mama?" Lily said in a solemn voice too serious for someone her age. Rosa looked down. "What is it?" "The pretty lady pushed Grandma." The towel slipped from Rosa's hands. She stared at her daughter, who was not smiling, not inventing, not playing. "What did you say?" "The pretty lady," Lily repeated, pointing vaguely toward the front of the house where Vivian might have been. "She pushed Grandma's stick with her foot. Then Grandma fell down the stairs." Rosa felt the room go cold around her. She set the towels aside, lowered herself to the floor, and gathered Lily into her lap. Children lied sometimes, yes. Children imagined things, misunderstood things, and retold chaos in strange ways. But Rosa knew her daughter. She knew the difference between fantasy and certainty. Lily's face held none of the excitement of make-believe. She looked as she always did when describing something simple and true. "Did anyone else see?" Rosa asked quietly. Lily thought for a moment, then shook her head. Rosa held her for a long time after that. The terrible thing about truth is not only hearing it, it is understanding the price of saying it aloud. Rosa had worked for Margaret Whitmore long enough to know what power looked like when it put on perfume and smiled. Margaret had hired her herself, not through an agency, not through a staffing director, but in the old kitchen over a cup of tea. During the interview, Margaret had asked her only one question that truly mattered. "Are you honest?" Rosa had answered yes. At the time, it had felt simple. Now it felt expensive. She had Lily to protect. She had a room in the East Wing. She had a salary that paid for rent she no longer had to worry about, food she could count on, and money sent home to her mother in Guadalajara. She had no backup plan, no savings worth naming, no relatives in the city. If Vivian became Mrs. Whitmore and Rosa accused her, even indirectly, what chance did she have of keeping her job, her housing, her child's stability. But Margaret Whitmore was lying in a hospital bed with a fractured hip because of what Lily had seen. Rosa tucked Lily into bed that night, kissed her forehead, and lay awake until dawn. 2 days later, Margaret returned home. The first-floor guest suite had been transformed into a recovery room elegant enough to hide the fact that it was, in essence, a medical station. Private nurse, physical therapist, medication schedule, special cushions, fresh flowers. Wealth had a way of making suffering look organized. Vivian was flawless through all of it. She coordinated appointments, greeted the medical staff warmly, asked thoughtful questions, and appeared at Margaret's doorway twice a day with a bouquet in one hand and a suitable expression in place. She behaved exactly as a devoted future daughter-in-law should. Margaret tolerated her. That was the word for it. Not welcomed, not appreciated. Tolerated. On the third day, when Vivian had just left the room and Rosa was adjusting the curtains, Margaret spoke without turning her head. "She's lying." Rosa kept her hands on the fabric. Margaret's voice was steady. "I know what happened. I felt the cane go before I lost my balance. Someone struck it, kicked it. I didn't slip. I was pushed." Rosa swallowed. "Mrs. Whitmore, you should rest," she said carefully. Margaret turned then, fixing her with a look sharpened by age, pain, and intelligence. "That means you know something." It was not phrased as a question. Rosa said nothing. But silence can be its own confession, and Margaret Whitmore was far too perceptive to miss one. That night, after Lily was asleep and most of the house had gone still, Rosa found Nathaniel alone in his study. He stood by the window in the dark, hands in his pockets, staring out at the grounds with that unnerving stillness some people have when they are thinking too hard. She knocked on the open door. He turned immediately. "Rosa, is everything all right?" She had practiced the words in her head. She had planned to phrase them carefully, to make it clear she was only repeating what Lily had said, not making an accusation herself. But when the moment arrived, plain truth seemed to demand plain language. "My daughter was in the hallway when your mother fell," Rosa said. Nathaniel's attention sharpened all at once. "Lily?" "She's 3, Rosa said quietly. "I know how that sounds, but she's told me the same thing more than once. The same way every time. No changes, no added details, just what she saw." His jaw tightened. "What did she see?" Rosa told him. Every word. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, the silence that followed was so long Rosa could hear the faint clock in the hallway outside. Nathaniel did not confront Vivian that night. He was too careful for that. Some cold, disciplined part of him understood that if Lily was wrong, if a child had misread movement, fear, or timing, then one accusation would destroy not just an engagement, but a woman's life, his reputation, and the architecture of a future he had already begun building. He needed more than instinct. He needed certainty. The Whitmore estate had a state-of-the-art security system, but not where he needed it. Cameras covered the gates, the driveway, the garage, the exterior doors. Margaret had always refused interior surveillance. She considered constant indoor monitoring vulgar and insulting. "If you need cameras to trust the people in your own house," she had once said, "you've hired the wrong people." So there was no footage from the staircase. No clean answer waiting inside a digital archive. Only a child's memory. For 2 days, Nathaniel said nothing. He attended meetings, reviewed contracts, took calls, signed off on decisions worth millions. At dinner, he sat across from Vivian and watched her with eyes that had changed. He studied her pauses, her smiles, the exact timing of her concern. He noticed the way she always said the right thing, the reassuring thing, the socially perfect thing. At first, years ago, he had seen that as grace. Now he wondered if it was rehearsal. On the second evening, while they were discussing wedding arrangements, the florist's revised proposals lay between them on the table. Vivian flipped through them lightly, discussing color palettes and candle heights with the calm confidence of someone secure in her position. At one point, she said, without looking up, "I do hope your mother recovers enough to enjoy the ceremony. I know she and I haven't always been close, but she matters to you. I want her to feel included." It was a generous sentence, thoughtful, exactly what anyone in her place should say. And for the first time, Nathaniel found it chilling. Because it fit too neatly. Because in 3 years, he could not remember one truly unguarded moment from her. Not a sloppy reaction, not an ugly impulse. Not a single occasion in which she had forgotten to manage what she looked like. On the third day, he asked to speak with Lily. Rosa brought her to the small sitting room near the kitchen. Lily wore a yellow dress and clutched a stuffed rabbit by one ear. She looked at Nathaniel with the unfiltered seriousness children reserve for adults they don't find particularly impressive. Then she climbed onto the sofa and set the rabbit beside her. Nathaniel sat across from her. "Hi, Lily." "Hi." "Your mother said you were upstairs playing with your blocks the other day." Lily nodded. "Did you see something happen?" She looked at her rabbit, then back at him. "The pretty lady pushed Grandma's stick." Nathaniel kept his voice gentle. "Which pretty lady?" Lily pointed immediately toward the front of the house. "The one with the long hair. The one with the sparkly ring." Vivian's engagement ring, large enough that even a child had noticed it. "What did she do with the stick?" Lily lifted her little foot and made a sideways motion. "She pushed it with her shoe, like this." "And then what happened?" "Grandma fell down the stairs and made a big noise." "Did the pretty lady help her?" Lily thought about that with great seriousness, as though accuracy mattered. "No," she said finally. "She looked down. Then she put her hand on her mouth like this." Lily copied the gesture. "And then?" Nathaniel asked. "She made a crying face, but she wasn't crying." Nathaniel felt something inside him go still. "Like pretending?" he asked. Lily nodded, already distracted by a loose thread on her rabbit's ear. He hired an investigator that afternoon. Not, at first, to investigate the fall itself. There was too little direct evidence. Instead, he asked for something broader, and in some ways, more revealing. He wanted a thorough look at the week leading up to the accident. Financial records, communications, unusual meetings, any pressure point that might explain motive. What he received 4 days later changed everything. 2 weeks before her fall, Margaret Whitmore had quietly arranged a meeting with her personal attorney. She intended to revise certain estate planning documents, specifically the trust structure related to Nathaniel's future marriage. The revisions would have placed substantial limits on what any future spouse could claim in the event of divorce. Margaret hadn't told Nathaniel yet. She had planned to, but she had not finalized the conversation with him. Vivian, however, had somehow found out. The investigator discovered that a paralegal inside Margaret's law firm had been feeding Vivian information for months. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, It had been done the way many dangerous things are done, quietly, socially, through lunch meetings, flattering attention, carefully chosen gifts, and a relationship invisible to formal records. By the time Margaret scheduled the revision, Vivian already knew what was coming. She knew that if those documents were signed, her financial expectations for the marriage would change drastically. She knew Margaret was the obstacle. And she knew time might not be on her side. Nathaniel read the investigator's report twice. It was nearly 40 pages long, dry in tone and devastating in meaning. When he finished, he sat alone in his study for a very long time, one hand pressed over his mouth, not in performance, but because the mind sometimes struggles to hold betrayal and logic in the same frame. Then he went to see his mother. Margaret was sitting up in bed, wearing glasses, doing a crossword puzzle with an expression that suggested she considered recovery an administrative inconvenience. She looked up the moment he walked in and knew immediately that something had changed. He sat beside her and told her everything. Rosa, Lily, the investigator, the trust revision leak, the lunches, the timing. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set the pencil down and looked at him for a long moment. "I told you I didn't fall," she said. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. "I know. I could see you doubted me. I wanted not to." Margaret was quiet for a few seconds. Then her voice softened in a way that was rare enough to be almost painful. "She nearly had me doubting myself," she said. "Do you understand that? I started wondering if maybe I had slipped after all. At my age, after the pain, after the shock, I wondered whether I'd imagined the certainty. There is nothing uglier than being made to question your own mind." Nathaniel took her hand. After a moment, Margaret gave a tiny exhale that might, in another woman, have become a laugh. "A 3-year-old restored my dignity," she said. "If you've made it this far, tell me honestly, would you have believed the child right away, or would you have looked for reasons not to? And while you're thinking about that, go ahead and subscribe, because stories like this remind us how truth usually survives in the smallest voices. That evening, Nathaniel asked Vivian to come to his study. She entered composed as ever, beautifully dressed, carefully neutral. There was a confidence about her, subtle but present, the confidence of someone who senses a difficult conversation coming and still believes she can guide it. She sat across from his desk. Nathaniel remained standing. For a few moments, he said nothing. He only looked at her. And silence, when offered by the right person, can be more unsettling than any accusation. Something shifted in her posture. Barely. Then Nathaniel spoke. "You've been having lunch with a paralegal from Harrington and Associates." Vivian blinked once. "I'm sorry?" "My mother's attorney's office." "I don't know what you think." "You knew about the trust revision." The words landed between them with calm finality. Vivian opened her mouth, then closed it. "Lily saw what you did," Nathaniel said. There it was. For 1 second, one single unguarded second, the mask came apart. Not fully, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for him to see that what lay underneath wasn't grief or even fear. It was calculation. She was still thinking, still measuring what angle remained. "She's 3, Vivian said finally. "Whatever she thinks she saw," she demonstrated how you kicked the cane. Nathaniel's voice never rose. "She described the hand over your mouth afterward. She described the expression on your face." Vivian said nothing. "My mother could have died." Still nothing. That silence told him more than denial ever could. Nathaniel moved to the door and opened it. "Get out of my house," he said. "Tonight. Do not take a single thing that wasn't yours before you entered it. My attorney will contact yours in the morning." For the first time since he had known her, Vivian looked like a woman who had reached the end of a performance and found no audience left to persuade. She left the estate that night with one overnight bag. No screaming, no begging, no scene worthy of witnesses. She walked out through the front entrance, got into her car, and drove away into the dark without looking back. Nathaniel stood in the hall and watched the taillights disappear through the gates. At first, he felt nothing. Not victory, not heartbreak, not rage. Only a vast, hollow absence. And then, slowly, unexpectedly, relief. So much relief that it frightened him. He had not realized how much tension he had been carrying in his own house until the source of it was gone. The formal reckoning came 10 days later. Nathaniel's attorney arranged a meeting in a conference room high above the city at Whitmore Group headquarters. Neutral ground officially, though nothing tied to Nathaniel Whitmore was ever truly neutral. Present were Nathaniel, his attorney, Vivian, Vivian's lawyer, and, at Nathaniel's specific request, Rosa Delgado. Vivian looked across the polished table at Rosa and said nothing. But her eyes sharpened. The message in them was unmistakable. "I know who helped this happen." Rosa held her gaze and did not look away. Nathaniel's attorney laid out the case methodically. The paralegal's connection to Vivian. The timing of the leaked information regarding the trust revision. The fall. Lily's account. Rosa's testimony. Margaret's statement. And one small but important physical detail from the medical and property review that had initially gone unnoticed. A scuff mark on the lower shaft of Margaret's cane, consistent with a sideways impact rather than a simple slip. Vivian's attorney attempted, twice, to interrupt with alternate interpretations and cautionary language. Twice, he stopped himself. Because the pattern was becoming too clear to challenge cleanly. Then Nathaniel placed a photograph on the table. It was an enlarged still taken from the exterior security camera of a neighboring estate. It could not see the interior staircase, but it could see part of the upstairs front window and the timing of movement within it. The image showed Vivian's silhouette moving away from the staircase landing shortly before the scream echoed through the house. Not running toward danger, walking away from it. Calmly, deliberately. 20 seconds. That was all it took to destroy the last version of innocence available to her. Vivian's composure didn't shatter in some dramatic, cinematic way. There was no collapse into tears, no desperate confession. What happened was somehow smaller and sadder. She simply seemed to run out of strength. The effort of holding herself together, of managing every line and expression, finally failed. She was going to ruin everything, Vivian said quietly. It sounded less like a defense than an exhausted truth spoken to the table instead of to any one person. Nathaniel stared at her. Ruin what? Vivian lifted her eyes and for the first time looked almost unprotected. My chance, she said. My safety. The room remained still. And in that moment, against his will, Nathaniel understood something about her that made the whole thing darker, not lighter. She had not attached herself to him out of love alone, perhaps not even primarily. She had run toward him as one runs toward shelter, toward wealth, security, permanence, insulation from whatever instability had shaped her before him. That understanding did not excuse what she had done, but it made her more human than villainous, and that was its own discomfort. His attorney spoke next. Vivian would cover Margaret's medical costs in full. She would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. In exchange, the Whitmores would decline to pursue criminal charges. It was a merciful settlement. Vivian knew it. Her lawyer knew it. And Nathaniel, despite everything, knew it too. 3 weeks later, Margaret Whitmore crossed the entrance hall on her own feet, with her cane in hand and no one helping her. The physical therapist had advised more caution. Margaret had rejected the suggestion with open irritation. She had survived not only a serious injury, but the far uglier wound of almost being persuaded to doubt her own reality. She was not going to wait one more week to reclaim her own floor. Nathaniel watched from the doorway as she moved slowly but proudly across the marble. Rosa had just finished setting the dining room table nearby, and Lily, small, serious, absorbed in her own universe, sat on the hall floor exactly as she had on the day of the fall, building something mysterious out of wooden blocks. Margaret stopped in front of her. Lily looked up. "Hello," Margaret said. "Hello," Lily replied. "I understand," Margaret said with formal gravity, "that you saw what happened to me." Lily considered that. "You fell down the stairs." "I was pushed," Margaret corrected gently. Lily nodded. "I know. I saw." Margaret looked at her for several long seconds. Then she said, very simply, "Thank you." Lily studied her with those clear, uncomplicated eyes children have, before life teaches them performance. "You're welcome," she said. Then she returned to her blocks. Nathaniel came to stand beside his mother. Together, they watched Lily construct a world only she understood. "She's remarkable," Margaret said. "She's 3. "Yes," Margaret said, "which is precisely why she's remarkable." She has no idea yet why truth becomes difficult for the rest of us. Nathaniel was quiet. After a while, he said, "I should have believed you immediately." Margaret made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "You believed a beautiful young woman over your stubborn old mother. I'm not shocked." He gave her a look. "I am," Margaret added, softening slightly. "Grateful that someone in this house still possessed incorruptible eyesight." She watched Lily for another moment. "Make sure that child gets a proper education," she said. Nathaniel glanced at her. "She's Rosa's daughter." Margaret gave him the same look she had been giving him since he was a boy too clever for his own good. "Find a way." That evening, Nathaniel sat with Rosa in the small sitting room off the kitchen. Rosa looked calm, but it was the kind of calm built over fear, the posture of someone still waiting for consequences to arrive. "You took a risk," Nathaniel said. "Yes." "You could have stayed quiet. It would have been safer." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" Rosa sat with the question for a moment. When she answered, her voice was quiet and steady. "Because your mother asked me, when she hired me, whether I was honest. I said yes, and I meant it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Lily will begin at Summerfield Academy in September. It's the best early education program in the city. Tuition, transportation, clothes, supplies, everything will be covered by the Whitmore family." Rosa stared at him. He lifted a hand slightly before she could protest. You may either thank me or argue with me. One of those options saves time. For the first time since entering the room, her composure broke. Not dramatically, just enough for gratitude and disbelief to meet in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," Nathaniel said. "Your daughter told the truth when adults around her were shaping lies. She did more for my family in half a minute than most people manage in a lifetime." Summer turned into fall. Lily started school in polished shoes too new for her and carried a backpack nearly as large as her torso. Margaret insisted on seeing her off the first day. Rosa cried in the kitchen after they left and denied it when anyone mentioned it later. The Whitmore estate changed in quieter ways, too. The wedding plans were canceled. Deposits were lost. Vendors were informed. The engagement announcement that had once been whispered through social circles as inevitable became one more carefully managed silence among people who understood wealth often traveled with scandal, even when scandal never reached the papers. Vivian disappeared from their lives almost as elegantly as she had entered it. The paralegal at Harrington and Associates was dismissed. The law firm quietly reinforced its internal ethics procedures. Vivian relocated to another city, and if she told her own version of events there, none of it made its way back to the Whitmores in any form that mattered. Nathaniel took months before he returned to anything resembling a personal life. Not because he was shattered in the romantic sense. That wasn't the deepest injury. The deeper wound was epistemic, though he would never have used that word aloud. He had trusted his own judgment, and his judgment had failed. He had confused elegance for integrity, calm for character, emotional fluency for truth. He became more patient with himself afterward, but also more precise. He learned that certainty about a person and accuracy about a person are not the same thing, and that the gap between them can cost more than money, time, or embarrassment. It can cost a family its safety, a woman her dignity, a son his confidence. Margaret, meanwhile, recovered with infuriating speed. She used her cane long after she no longer fully needed it, partly for support, and partly, Nathaniel suspected, because she enjoyed what it symbolized now: survival, stubbornness, refusal. 10 months later, the Whitmore Family Foundation opened a new literacy center on the east side of the city. Margaret attended the ribbon cutting. Photographers gathered in front of the building to capture the moment, and in more than one image that ran later in local coverage, Margaret stood between two figures. Her son, Nathaniel, a man altered in ways no camera could capture, and a small girl in a bright red dress, holding Margaret's free hand with mild distraction, because she cared more about the balloons tied nearby than about the significance of the event. That small girl was Lily. She had no idea she had changed the course of anything. No idea that her plain sentence in a laundry room had ended an engagement, saved her mother from retaliation, restored an older woman's confidence in her own memory, and taught a powerful man the difference between performance and truth. Margaret, who had spent much of her life allowing photographers to document her with dignified restraint, smiled openly in those pictures, not because of the cameras, because of the child beside her. And maybe because she understood something most people learn too late: that the purest forms of courage rarely arrive looking dramatic. Sometimes they arrive in a yellow dress with a stuffed rabbit, describing exactly what they saw. If this story is hitting you the way it hit me, drop a like and subscribe before the ending reflection. Because what happened here wasn't just about betrayal, It was about how easily truth can be ignored when it comes from the wrong mouth. In the months that followed, Nathaniel found himself thinking less about Vivian and more about the mechanics of deception. How it works. Why it works. Why intelligent people fall for it. Why polished lies often outrun awkward truths. He realized that deception does not always depend on brilliance. Often, it depends on timing, confidence, and the target's desire to believe. Vivian had not cast some magical spell over him. She had simply offered a version of herself that matched what he wanted to be true. And because wanting and seeing are never quite the same act, he had accepted the version available to him. Margaret, unsurprisingly, had opinions about this. "You were lonely," she told him one evening over tea. "That's a dramatic interpretation. It's an accurate one." He sighed. "Must you always be correct with such confidence?" "Yes," she said. "That's one of my better qualities." Then, after a pause, she added, "Next time choose a woman who is honest." "I know. And kind." At that, Nathaniel said nothing. Because kindness, he now understood, is not charm. It isn't polish, and it certainly isn't the instinctive ability to say socially perfect things. Kindness leaves evidence in how a person behaves when no reward is attached, in how they treat those beneath them, in what they do when frightened, in whether another person's vulnerability triggers care or opportunity. Vivian had wanted safety, but when she felt threatened, she had turned someone else's body into the price of keeping it. That was not fear alone. That was character. And character, Nathaniel had learned, cannot be inferred from beauty, fluency, or self-control. It reveals itself only at pressure points. Rosa remained at the estate. At first, she had expected the atmosphere to change around her. People often say they value honesty until honesty becomes inconvenient. But the opposite happened. Margaret trusted her more than before. Nathaniel made sure her compensation increased. Lily's school fees were handled without discussion. And over time, Rosa moved through the house less like a shadow and more like someone whose place there had become undeniable. She still worked hard, still kept to herself, still preferred the background to the spotlight. But there was now a quiet dignity in the way the household regarded her. She had done what many people with more security would not have done. She had told the truth when it could have cost her everything. Lily, of course, understood none of the politics. She cared about crayons, bedtime stories, picture books, whether the garden fountain had frogs in it, and why adults always spoke in different voices on the phone than they did in person. She asked Margaret impossible questions about old photographs. She once informed Nathaniel that his ties were boring. She developed a habit of building towers in the entrance hall and refusing help when they fell. Margaret adored her in a way she never would have admitted publicly. One afternoon, Nathaniel came home early and found the two of them in the library. Margaret was reading aloud from a large illustrated book while Lily sat cross-legged on the carpet, interrupting every third sentence with questions that would have driven most adults mad. "What happened to the wolf after that?" "He went away." "Why?" "Because that is what wolves in children's books do when the story is over." "Did he learn a lesson?" Margaret lowered the book and stared at her. "Probably not. Very few wolves do." Nathaniel stood in the doorway, smiling, before either of them noticed him. Margaret looked up first. "You're late for witnessing your own sentimental education," she said dryly. "I'll try to schedule it more carefully next time." Lily pointed at him. "Grandma said wolves don't learn lessons." "Grandma is usually right," he said. Margaret sniffed. "Usually?" But beneath the banter, something in the room felt restored. Not the old order, not innocence, that never returns exactly as it was, but something sturdier. A family reassembled around truth instead of appearances. And perhaps that was the real ending to all of it. Not the dismissal of a paralegal, not the canceled wedding, not the signed legal agreements, not even the confrontation that exposed Vivian at last. The real ending was quieter. It was Margaret walking through her own house without doubting her own memory. It was Rosa no longer feeling invisible in the place where she had once feared being disposable. It was Nathaniel learning that love without discernment is merely hope in elegant clothes. And it was Lily, small and serious, still too young to understand why adults complicate what they see so easily. What struck me most about this story was never the betrayal itself. Betrayal, sadly, is common. Money, inheritance, fear, ambition, those motives are old as history. What struck me was the route the truth had to take to survive. It didn't come from surveillance footage inside the home. It didn't come from some immediate confession under pressure. It didn't even come first from the powerful people in the room. It came from a child sitting on the floor with wooden blocks, who had no reason to distort what she saw, and no understanding of the stakes attached to it. She had not yet learned the adult art of softening reality so it can be more easily lived with. And maybe that is why she was the only one who could name it cleanly. How often do we dismiss what children notice because we assume complexity belongs to adults alone? How often do we explain away their observations because our world has taught us that innocence must equal ignorance? But innocence is not ignorance. Sometimes, innocence is the last uncorrupted lens in the room. Rosa understood that enough to speak. Margaret understood that enough to listen. Nathaniel, to his credit, understood it enough to investigate rather than ignore. And that is why the truth, though delayed, survived. So, if you were Rosa, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, knowing you could lose your home, your job, and the fragile stability you built for your child? Or would fear have convinced you to remain silent and pray the damage stopped where it already was? And if you were Nathaniel, what would have broken your trust first? Your mother's certainty, the child's consistency, or the cold perfection of the woman sitting across the breakfast counter, telling you exactly what you wanted to hear? Maybe the hardest question is this one. When truth arrives from an unexpected source, do we have the courage to believe it before evidence makes belief convenient? Because in the Whitmore house, that was the difference between a story ending as a tragedy and ending as a warning. A warning that not every graceful person is good. A warning that not every frightened person is harmless. A warning that power does not guarantee clarity. And a reminder, small, stubborn, unforgettable, that sometimes the most honest witness in the room is the one still playing on the floor. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you're watching from and what part hit you the hardest. And if you want more gripping stories written in this same style, subscribe now, because the next one might make you question who you would trust when everything looks perfect on the surface.